2017, I thought I'd give you some tips on floating color. This is what works for me. There's a lot of different ways to float color, but this is the one that works for me. The first thing you need is a good brush. You need a brush with a good chisel edge. I use, the smallest brush I generally use to float color is the 1/2 inch angle brush. I like an angle brush. If I want a really large area, I may go to a larger brush, but for most everything I use the 1/2 inch. If I want a larger area, I will load more brush on the tip, and if I want a tiny area, I'll load less brush on the tip. But having a good brush with a good chisel edge is a must. The other thing that I think that works for me is a wet palette. I like a wet palette. I think it helps you to get a better float. There's many palettes out there that you can purchase that are for painting, but this is the one I use. I like the size on this. This is a Tupperware. It is a freezer container. I believe they're still available, but it's the right size for me, and I like this size, so I use this for my wet palette. I will use the bottom, and I always put a paper towel for the padding. You can use a sponge, and you can buy a sponge to fit, or different things that will fit on here, but I like the paper towel because sometimes I let my palette sit for a long time and I don't get back to it, and then it gets moldy. And so then you have to clean the sponge, and I don't like cleaning a moldy sponge. So I find the paper towel works just fine, and if I let it sit for a long time and it happens to get old, I can just roll up the towel and put it away and throw it away. I don't have to clean the sponge. I take 2 layers of paper towel and I fold it to fit onto my tray here, and then I use a piece of deli sheet. You can buy the palette paper, but I choose to use the deli sheets, and I have bought them at Sam's Club, and there's different brands. This is one brand, and this is the one I'm using today. Sometimes when you go, you can only find certain brands. This is another brand, and I have used that, but it's very thin and it rips very easily, but I do use it sometimes. Well, I was using it when I couldn't find the other brand. Then when I'm done and I want to done for the day, I put the lid on this way and I push it down and seal it, and that keeps my paint fresh. I'm going to go over to the sink and show you how I get this palette wet, because I think that is an important part of my procedure. The wet palette needs to be prepared properly. So I'll be right back. I'll be over the sink. Okay, so this is how I prepare my palette. I take it to the sink, I run it under water, I make sure the towel gets completely wet. I want the paper towel to be completely wet, no dry spots. Then I lay the deli sheet on top and I flatten it down. Okay, I might let the water drip off a little bit more, so that all the water, or most of the water, is out. Okay, then I want to make sure that the deli sheet lays completely flat. with no air bubbles, because if there's air bubbles underneath, that will, your deli sheet will dry out really fast. So I'm going to make sure that there's no air bubbles and that it lies completely flat. I know some people might use a credit card for this, but I find it just works fine to just use my hand. Now I want to show you something before I forget. When I do go to put the lid on, I make sure that none of these little pieces are sticking out, because if you put the lid on tight and that's sticking out, then the deli sheet will dry out. So before you put the lid on, you want to make sure all these corners are tucked in. And then when you put the lid on, the corners won't dry out. So I make sure all these corners are tucked in before I put the lid on. Okay. So that's how I prepare my palette. Now, some people use a dry palette, and that's fine too. That works for them. This works for me. I suggest if you're having trouble floating color, try different techniques. And this is one of the techniques. Okay, so then I put my paint on the dry palette, or on the wet palette, excuse me, and that helps keep the paint from drying out. Now, when I first prepare my palette, it may be a little too wet. After a while, it gets a little too dry. I get used to adjusting to the fact that it may be too wet or too dry. If in the beginning, as you go to blend your brush, you feel it's too wet, you might take a dry paper towel and just take some of the moisture off. I don't usually do that. I just have figured out how to adjust to the difference in the palette as it starts out wet and then gets drier. Okay, I'm going to try floating on this mat board. I hope it works pretty good. I generally keep soap in my brush. I keep ivory soap in my brush for sizing. So the first thing I'm going to do is rinse my brush off. And then I'll rinse the soap out of my brush. And then I squeeze it to blot it off. So then I'm going to chisel edge into the water. That is, I'm just going to touch the chisel edge. Let's see if I can show you this. Just touch the chisel edge into the water. So just go in enough to get the chisel edge to pick up some water. Then I'm going to touch it off on my paper towel. That just pulls a little bit of water out. Then I will corner load. Now for a medium load, I'll corner load half of the brush, and then I blend it on my palette. Now this is the another important part for me. When I'm blending on my palette, I'm spreading the bristles. Okay, so I'm spreading my bristles to get that paint across the brush. I see a lot of people just going like this. That's not going to get the paint into your bristles if you just kind of lightly do that. If you go in one direction, that's okay, but you need to really spread those bristles. I usually go in both directions so that I load both sides of the brush. Now you want to make sure that the brush, there's strong color here and it fades off to nothing. If you start seeing, if I were to have picked up some paint on my brush and I start seeing paint all the way across, let me get a little bit more. If I start seeing paint all the way across my brush, then I know I'm not going to get a good float. It has to start out strong and fade away to nothing. So I'm going to clean my brush now because the paint is all the way across. Now, this paper is just a little bit wetter than ideal. So I'm going to try to blot a little bit off of it here to show you. And have it a little bit drier. So again, I'm going to just chisel edge into the water. Touch on my paper towel. Pick up the paint, a good corner load, depending on how wide you want it. And then I'm going to blend it down here. Now I always, and I've just gotten in the habit of this, I always load my brush twice. So after I've blended it, I chisel edge it again. I touch, and then I load it a second time. I just have gotten in that habit and I do it. Now I can see that because the paper is wetter than normal, I might take my finger and just very lightly pull a little of that water off of the brush. And then I'm going to float some color. So I'm going to pull the color and then you wait for it to dry, and there I have a nice float from strong color over to nothing. This paint is not really too dark. Second time I load, if I haven't cleaned my brush, I only do it once. That's a nice float. I'm going to put some darker color, use some darker color so you can see it better. Okay, I'm going to chisel edge my brush into the water. That's just touch it, the chisel edge into the water. Then I'm going to touch it on my paper towel just to draw out a little bit of paint, not much, just lightly touching it. Then I'm going to pick up the paint, corner load, and for an average float, I'll pick up just a corner load of paint, and then I'm going to blend it on my palette. Now this is really important to spread those bristles. Now if you happen to get some color into the heel of your brush, when you're blending, you see that the color is all the way across your brush, you want to clean your brush and start over. So it's important to have a clean brush, and it's important to have clean water. When you rinse your brush into dirty water, that's going to give you a dirty float across. So it's important to have clean water to chisel edge your brush into. So I'm going to chisel edge into the water. I'm going to touch on my paper towel. I'm going to pick up a corner load, and I'm going to blend it on my palette, spreading those bristles so that there's strong color here, fading away to nothing. And then I will pull the float. And I have strong color fading away to nothing. Now, when I float, I pick up color again. When I float, generally, if I'm floating along a line, get a pencil here. Say I'm floating along something here. I will coax my paint. I'll coax it along, and then finish with one swoop. That's how I float color. I coax, 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 and then one final swoop to smooth it out. And I can use both sides of the brush because I have blended both sides of the brush. Now if I want to do just a small area, I will pick up just a tiny bit of paint. I will pick up just a tiny bit of paint if I'm doing a small area. And I'll blend it. And then I'll float just a small area. And this came from the fact that I just don't like to keep changing brushes. So I can do a small float or a large float with the same brush. I also, if you want to coax it, if you want to walk it out, you can float your color and then walk it, pull it out, pull it out, pull it out, and that will give you a wider float, and you can walk your color down. The other thing is, if you want a glaze of color or a very light bit of color onto your piece, I load my brush as I normally would. This is a glaze of color. And then, instead of going right to the board, I will again chisel edge it into the water. I'll find a damp area on my paper towel, somewhere that's damp, and I pull some color off, first on one side, and then another damp area, and I pull some color off on the other side. Then I can put a light glaze of color on, and it won't be as strong. So that's how I glaze color. I hope this helps. I hope you're able to, it will help you with your floating, and thank you for watching.